It's 2 p.m., so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's joint webinar between the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We will have speakers from the Building Science Branch and FEMA's Risk Management Directorate. So we're excited to have this webinar today. I would like to point out that the webinar will be recorded, and so today's recording, the slides and transcript will be posted on the HUD Exchange at a later date. And for participants, please be mindful that today's presentation is in listen mode only. If you have any issues, technical issues, please submit those technical questions to the Q&A box that should be on the right side of your screen. As today's webinar is in listen mode only, please submit your content-related questions to the same Q&A box that's on the right side of your screen. We will monitor those questions and address as many of those as possible at the end of our webinar today. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our host, Ms. Joshani Clemens, and so I would like to thank you for all of your help in getting us set up today. And I wanted to know, Joshani, if you wanted to quickly speak to the survey.
Hi, thank you for that, Rose. Hi, you all. Can you hear me? I'm sure you can. There is a box entitled Click to Eval. That is where we house our level 1. So if you click on that link that says SurveyMonkey, you will be allowed to take the level 1 before you leave out of this quote-unquote room. Have a great meeting, guys. Oh, I'm sorry. Also, you will be able to download your presentation, and there is a handout that the presenters want to share with you guys, and that is in the Files to Download box directly below the Click to Eval box. Thanks, you guys, and have a great meeting.
Okay, thank you again, Joshani. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge that this is part of the 2020 CDBG-MIT webinar series. We are a little over halfway through the series here, and today's webinar is titled Using ASCE 24 for CDBG-MIT Projects. Again, I'd like to acknowledge the support from FEMA's Risk Management Directorate, and in particular their Building Science Branch, and they will be the primary presenters for today. Before I continue, I have a few notes that HUD leadership would like for me to speak to. First, I'd like to state that at the outset here, HUD CDBG-MIT notice outlines the beneficial use of ASCE 24 standards for elevation projects, and the notice encourages grantees to propose an allocation of CDBG-MIT funds for building code development and for implementation, and that's certainly a very positive development. However, this includes elevation standards for new construction, repair of structures with substantial damage or substantial improvement to structures, and that information, as described by HUD, is in the Federal Register notice that was published last August for the CDBG-MIT program, and I would encourage you to take a look at page 45864. That's 45864 for more context. With that being said, I'd like to emphasize before we go any further that using ASCE 24 may be characterized as a best practice. Grantees are not required to use this standard, but certainly, and certainly HUD does not require it in its Federal Register notice. That being said, ASCE 24, as presented today, is an option, certainly for consideration by grantees, that they can utilize to be in compliance with HUD's elevation requirements. With that, I'd like to go ahead and do some introductions. Give me 1 second. I'd like to start off with Mr. John Ingargiola. He is the lead physical scientist for the Building Science Branch. and FEMA's Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Ngargiola's work involves a broad range of mitigation activities that include pre- and post-disaster building sciences, disaster building sciences, building science education, working with codes and standards and producing organizations, building code strategy and policy development, development of technical guidance related to hazard mitigation, and coordination with various mitigation partners in the public and private sector. So certainly we welcome John today to support us with this webinar. Thank you so much. We also have Mr. Adam J. Reeder, who is with CDM Smith, and he's a principal there. Adam is going to be one of our lead speakers today. He's a civil engineer with 24 years of experience in a wide range of structural engineering projects. He is a nationally recognized expert for building science, especially for wind and flood mitigation. So thank you, Adam, so much for joining us today. We have Clay Lloyd, Clay is with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and he is a CPD specialist within the Division of Disaster Recovery and Special Issues. He'll be speaking to our CDBG-MIT slides, so thank you, Clay, for joining us. Last, I'm Roosevelt Grant. I'm also with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I'm on a temporary assignment and supporting the policy unit within the DRSI division. With that, I'd like to do a quick overview of our agenda today. So first we have CDBG-MIT program overview. Again, this is connected to that Federal Register Notice language that I spoke of regarding ASCE 24. We have an overview of flood requirements for a CDBG-MIT mitigation grant. We'll be looking at what is ASCE 24 and what does it cover. We'll also address the question of complying with ASCE 24 for a CDBG mitigation grant. We'll be looking at providing with an overview of ASCE 24 with use particularly related to residential and non-residential mitigation projects. We'll focus on historic buildings, the benefits of using ASCE 24, how you can get access to ASCE 24, and then finally we'll provide you with some resources when you choose to utilize that standard. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Clay.
Hi, everyone. My name's Clay Lloyd. I work at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I am a CPD specialist who is located in the Disaster Recovery and Special Issues Division, who manages the CDBG Disaster Recovery Program and the CDBG-MIT program. All right, so with that, I'd like to start off by talking a little bit to our grantees who received the CDBG-MIT funds and go through the overview of the purpose of the CDBG-MIT allocation. CDBG-MIT was based on the CDBG program, which is a normal annual appropriation across the U.S. And so this program is different than that one, but it's based on it. And the goal of that program, the same as this, is to help develop communities, provide decent housing, a suitable living environment, and expanding economic opportunities with a focus on low and moderate income persons. That's the overview of the program itself. We published a Federal Register notice that went into further detail of the purpose of the CDBG-MIT allocation. And the high-level items in that notice was we wanted projects that met the definition of a mitigation activity. We want projects that address current and future risks as identified in the grantee's mitigation needs assessment with a focus of at least 50% on the most impacted and distressed areas. And we wanted, your project should be CDBG eligible. There's a variety of eligible activities. It's a flexible funding source. And lastly, all projects should meet a national objective, including additional criteria for mitigation activities in covered projects. That's further detailed in the notice. So to give you an idea of the type of projects that CDBG-MIT funds can be used for, it can be used to support infrastructure projects, housing activities, public services, economic development, disaster preparedness, and planning efforts. And CDBG-MIT specifically, we're looking to have it increase resilience and reduce and eliminate risk per HUD's definition. And another requirement that's a little bit different for this allocation is that we have a goal, a requirement of 50% of CDBG-MIT funds to be used to benefit low to moderate income persons in that community. All right, and just one more higher level overview before I hand it off to talk more about the ASCE Stand 24 standard. We're also encouraging that grantees are maximize their CDBG-MIT allocation. We're looking to have them maximize their impact by partnering with other mitigation projects that might be funded through FEMA, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Forest Service, and other agencies. And we're also asking that grantees advance the long-term resilience and current future hazards for their region, align its CDBG-MIT program or projects with other planned federal, state, regional, or local capital improvements, and to promote community level and regional planning for current and future disaster recovery efforts. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Adam.
Thanks, Clay. My name is Adam Reeder. I'm with CDM Smith. We're a consultant to FEMA Building Sciences, and I've been specifically working with FEMA Building Sciences for about since 2007. But prior to that, I had some experience with doing some mitigation projects, particularly elevating houses, since about 1999. So today I'm going to walk through quickly ASCE 24, a little bit about what's in it.
Give us 1 second. We're having a little technical issue here with the speaker, but give us a minute.
Is that working now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? My microphone says it's working. Okay, so my name is Adam Reeder. I'm with CDM Smith. I've been supporting FEMA Building Sciences since about 2007. And before that, I worked on some elevation projects since about 1999 with elevating houses that were flood prone. So some instances where CDBG mitigation, the reference document discusses ASCE 24, discusses it in the long-term planning section as being something that a community would seek to adopt with ASCE 7. And we'll talk about ASCE 24 and ASCE 7 in a few minutes so that you can kind of understand what those are. The other point is with building codes and hazard mitigation planning, there's also some references to ASCE 7, but most importantly, and what we're going to talk about today, are specifically when we're talking about elevation standards for new construction, repair of substantial damage, or substantial improvements. So there are two specific requirements. One, that all structures located in the special flood hazard area, that's that 100-year floodplain or 1% annual chance floodplain, that all those that are new construction, repair of substantial damage, and substantial improvements be elevated with the lowest floor, including the basement, and we'll talk about that, to at least 2 feet above the base flood elevation. The guidance also discusses that users can adopt ASCE 24 if it results in a higher elevation than the 2 feet that's required. And then we'll talk a little bit more about this mixed use requirement and specifically what that means. But a lot of what that means is you have buildings where you may have residential and commercial or non-residential uses in the same building and how those requirements apply. So we'll spend a little bit more time on that in a few minutes. There's some handouts that you guys can download. The handout on ASCE using ASCE 24 has a copy of the agenda, who the speakers are. There's a description of flood design terms if you're not familiar with those, acronyms. Working in this industry, we use a lot of acronyms, and I wanted to clear up what those were so people didn't have questions. There's a guidance document on using a flood map and how to read the flood map and what the different parts of it mean. There's a document on highlights of ASCE 24, flood-resistant design and construction, and that was put together by FEMA Building Sciences, so that's attached. And then we're going to spend a little time talking about non-residential structures, so we'll get into the use of the FEMA floodproofing certificate if you're not familiar with that, and I wanted to just make sure that you had that in your hands so that you could spend some time looking at that if you're looking at a floodproofing project. So I'm going to go into two standards pretty quickly. This one first, because it's also mentioned in the guidance. ASCE 7 is the minimum design loads for associated criteria for buildings and other structures. This is where engineers would actually calculate the loads associated with buildings. And so it tells you how to calculate the loads and then how to use the flood loads in addition to the other loads that might be on the building. So that may be the people inside the building, the live loads, that may be the dead loads or the actual weight of the building, as well as things like the wind loads, and if you're in an earthquake-prone area, the seismic loads. Chapter 5 specifically addresses the flood loads, and then you'll see there's a list of the commentary section. That's just a more descriptive section on that. Chapter 2 is on load combinations. As I just said, that's actually how you pair those loads with the other loads to the building. And then Section 3 is also important to look at because that gets into soil loads where you might have a basement area or you might have a foundation that's in a saturated soil. So once the floodwaters rise, how those floodwaters and the soils combined are impacting the building. So those are all sections that you'll want to look at if you're looking at these flood prone projects. And then that ASCE 7 and ASCE 24 are actually kind of used together in conjunction. So this is the flood standard, that's flood resistant design and construction. It addresses construction materials, design and engineering requirements. It tells you some references for testing of materials and sort of what those other associated standards look like. ASCE standards are developed through a consensus process. That means there's balloting in a committee and there's a public review process. And these people that are on these committees are industry organizations and professional associations, along with FEMA's got representation. So ASCE covers construction materials, design and engineering requirements and testing procedures. As I said, it was a consensus document, and it was worked on by several industry organizations, professional associations, as well as there are also engineers, contractors, as well as federal government representation. And it's typically incorporated into the building codes through a reference. So a brief overview of the sections. There's a section 1 or chapter 1 is a general section with scoping and definitions and some basic requirements. Also the tie to ASCE 7.
Chapter 2 are the basic requirements for most riverine flooding areas, so areas that there's not a high coastal hazard. And then Chapter 3 are high flood risk areas. You'll see a listing there of different types of areas where there may be extreme flood conditions. Chapter 4 are going to be the high hazard areas. Those are typically known as V zones, so think about that as mainly the shoreline. And then coastal A zones, which we'll talk about in a minute, but these are areas where there's what we would call moderate wave action. Chapter 5 are materials. And then you'll see that note down there that says that it utilizes modified flood zone designation. That's this coastal A zone that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Chapter 6 is dry and wet floodproofing, and we'll talk about what those are and what the difference is when we get into the residential and the non-residential sections. 7 are the utilities and equipment. That's mainly your MEP systems, lifts, that sort of thing. Chapter 8, building access, think stairs and that sort of thing. Chapter 9 are miscellaneous construction. You can see a whole list of accessory structures, decks, porches, garages, that sort of thing. Chapter 10 is references, and then there's commentary on all of these chapters. And the next thing we're going to talk about are these flood design classes that buildings are broken into. So there's approximately 4 classes. The Class 1 are mainly agricultural type buildings. Class 2 are the majority of buildings. That's going to be mainly your residential and non-residential kind of commercial type buildings. 3 are going to be large occupancy areas like think schools, but also a lot of your utilities like water treatment, wastewater treatment facilities fall into this. And then flood design class 5 are essential facilities. Think hospitals, fire, rescue, ambulance, your key needs, and then emergency operations centers. So talking about these flood zones that ASCE 24 covers, the V zone are areas right along the shoreline where we have 3-foot or greater waves. There's some specific requirements to what the foundations need to be built to in these areas and how high the buildings need to be. We're going to show you a diagram later on that talks about this bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member as how the elevation is rated. So then we get into coastal A zones. That's where we have 1.5 to 3-foot breaking waves. ASCE 24 requires similar compliance to the V zone in these areas, and these are newly mapped on the more recent flood maps, and we've kind of got a diagram that shows where they are. You're required to use these when the map actually delineates that or when the community delineates that. And A zones are areas where we have less than 1.5-foot waves. And in these areas, it's your standard compliance is similar to what you're used to probably in these riverine zones. The next thing I am going to talk about is these riverine zones and what those flood zones look like. There's a whole list of different flood zones for these. We typically refer to these as A zones, but you'll see them on the maps listed as A zones, AE zones. And then on the older flood maps, A1 through 30, these are typically areas where you've got, you're within the 100-year floodplain, and that's broken up into 2 main sections. There's sort of the flood fringe, which are those outer areas, which is showing in this with fill, those darker shaded brown areas, and then the floodway, which is this area where we want to try and limit construction within the floodway because that's where the majority of floodwaters are conveyed during a flood event. But you'll see the different types of flood zones and what they mean. In these areas like AO zones, those are areas of shallow flooding, and there may be a base flood elevation in some of those. And in other times, there's not a base flood elevation. In those, the rule is that the minimum requirement is 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade. It's a little trickier when you're using ASCE 24 in order to figure out what to do, but pretty much we're equating that 2 feet above grade with what the BFE is effectively in those areas in terms of minimum construction requirements. As we kind of look at these types of buildings, when we looked at the type of the requirements, it referred to new construction, substantial improvements, and substantial damage. And so I thought I'd want to talk about what substantial damage and substantial improvement are. Substantial damage is once a building is damaged that's constructed within the 100-year floodplain, if it is damaged by anything, that could be flooding, but it could also be a fire or tornado, wind event. If the damage or the cost to repair the structure exceeds 50% of the market value of the structure before the damage occurred, then it's determined to be substantially damaged, and it needs to be brought into compliance with whatever that community's current requirements are in terms of whatever their floodplain ordinance says. So it needs to be brought current. Substantial improvement refers to repair, reconstruction, rehabilitation, additions, that sort of thing, of a building which equals or exceeds 50% of the market value before that repair started. There's a lot more nuance to this, and that's provided in FEMA P758. That's that substantial improvement and substantial damage desk reference. And typically the way that I look up when I refer to these FEMA documents is I go to a web browser, I type in FEMA, and then whatever that publication number, in this instance it's P758, and then from there you can usually do a search and it'll come up pretty quickly. So ASCE 24 and the National Flood Insurance Program, how do those two match up to each other? ASCE 24 is consistent with the National Flood Insurance Program. It meets or exceeds those National Flood Insurance Program requirements, and it establishes effectively the new minimum requirements because it's become the standard of practice with respect to the codes and a lot of adoptions with states and local governments in terms of them adopting it. It provides, ASCE 24 provides more specific requirements. It incorporates that coastal lay zone that we talked about, and it has foundation requirements specific to that. It requires new construction, substantial improvement, substantial damage construction to incorporate freeboard. And with the HUD standard, we'll talk about how that changes with ASCE 24. It requires dry flood proofing to consider human intervention. That's basically, human intervention is when people need to install things or react in order to prepare the building to be dry flood proofed. So how does this, how does ASCE 24 and the CDBG-Mitigation Programmatic, how do you make sure that there's compliance with ASCE 24? So if you don't have new construction or substantial improvements, in a lot of instances you may not be able to comply or required to comply with every provision of ASCE 24, even if you have said you were going to use it as part of your grant application in terms of adopting it as part of a larger program. And you may have some instances where you're retrofitting buildings, such as elevating houses, where you may not be able to comply completely with ASCE 24, and certain sections may be deemed to comply. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that works when we start to talk about specifically elevation projects where you may be leaving part of the foundation in place. Just to note that cities or state building codes may require compliance with ASCE 24, and adherence to ASCE 24 may be required for compliance with other funding sources. So, for instance, if you are using this with many of the FEMA grant programs for a more recent disaster, then you are likely required to comply with ASCE 24 the way that the new policy is written. So after, I think it's September of 2016, you're going to be, those disasters declared after that date are going to be required to comply with ASCE 24. So you do need to look at your funding source. So how do we document that we've complied? Make sure it was designed and constructed to comply with ASCE 27 and 24. Make sure you can document that compliance and that it does comply with all building codes, applicable building codes, and floodplain ordinances. So that could be a statement or an affidavit from a design professional, and a statement or affidavit from a local official saying that basically it was completed and the design meets or exceeds ASCE 24. So design professionals should be made aware that they're going to need to incorporate it into their design, so you need to let them know that, as well as on a local level, officials need to make sure that they've kind of made sure that they can go back and verify compliance. If you're not familiar with it, that may mean that your engineer may need to go and evaluate the building further with maybe a special inspection in order to make sure that it complies if you're not familiar with it. So just something to consider as you're going through those. There's an additional recommendation within the CDBG-MIT guidance that says that you're going to use the latest issued flood guidance. So that could be the latest, including things like preliminary flood maps, as opposed to just your effective maps. It could be using ABFEs. Those are advisory-based flood elevations. So you're going to have to go through and look at what that latest flood data is that's available for that site, and apply that as part of the recommendations on using the latest flood hazard data. Applying the CDBG mitigation projects with codes and standards and ordinances. The projects through the requirements are that they need to meet state and local ordinances. If no code exists, then the proposed project should meet a code that may be a model code that's current. And then you want to make sure that you're not in violation of any federal laws, regulations, or statutes. So you're agreeing to all of those things. If you're not in compliance with those three things, then you may have some issues with eligibility requirements. So planning on doing a code compliance check, each project should go through a code compliance check. You should make sure that you're meeting those substantial improvement, substantial damage requirements. Those substantial improvement, substantial damage requirements are consistent for National Flood Insurance Program communities, that they're going to actually perform that, and that's not even an ASCE 24 requirement. That's a minimum NFIP requirement. So if you're part of that program, then you're going to do that substantial damage, substantial improvement determination. And then there's lots of classifications of work that the international codes reference, and you're just going to need to make sure that you understand what the requirements of the code are with respect to that classification of work. So code adoption versus standards, just briefly going through what's a code versus a standard. States and communities typically adopt these building codes and enforce those, and those are minimum requirements for the structure design, materials, and hazards. And then these standards like ASCE 24 and ASCE Standard 7 are usually referenced within sections of the code saying that they will be designed in accordance with, for instance, ASCE 7 and ASCE 24. So those standards are referenced within the building codes as to what needs to be followed. So using it with residential mitigation projects, this applies mainly to single-family, multifamily, and residential portions of mixed-use buildings. Typically, this is retrofit elevations, so think about jacking up a building or something similar, or reconstruction of a building. So this may be a building that's so damaged that it makes more sense to tear down the building and then reconstruct it. Another instance of where it might make sense is that if you have a building that's in poor condition, and if you elevate that building, the wind may knock that building down. It may be less expensive to just reconstruct the building. And this could also happen just when you compare elevation cost versus constructing a new building. There are instances where it's just that costly to elevate the building. Dry floodproofing, and it's not an allowable mitigation measure, but we will cover it in the next section. And then wet floodproofing, this is basically using flood damage resistant materials and flood openings to equalize the flood loads on the inside and outside of the building walls, and that's only allowable for parking areas, building access, and storage areas. Prior to design, you should look at which provisions of ASCE 24 apply and make sure that you're going to apply it to all the components that you can make comply with ASCE 24. So what are the minimum requirements as far as those elevation requirements? As we talked about, each of these flood design classes has some minimum requirements. The minimum requirement for these CDBG buildings are going to be this base flood elevation plus 2 feet. And for areas that are in Zone A, that's to the top of the lowest floor. Now, there are specific definitions of what that lowest floor means, because if you have a basement, that basement is included as the lowest floor, and a basement would be an area that's in your handout, but that's an area where you have 4 walls that are below grade, and in those areas that may require you to fill the basement and no longer have that basement in that house if it's in a special flood hazard area, and then the lowest floor would be the next higher floor. So there's a requirement of BFE plus 2 unless you're talking about a critical or essential facility, and then it's BFE plus 3 or the DFE. So for residential, just think that BFE plus 2 as those minimum requirements. So in V zones and coastal A zones, similar, it's at BFE plus 2, but this is to the lowest horizontal structural member, and we've got a diagram coming up that'll show you what that is. So if we're looking at this, the allowable foundation types in an A zone, you're allowed to use fill, you're allowed to use walls, you're allowed to use columns and piles, all as allowable foundations. And if you're looking at these A zones, then the requirement is to that top of that lowest floor that's shown there on the right. If we look at the bottom area, the V zones and coastal A zones, these are areas where there's high waves and the water is moving very quickly. We're not allowed to use fill, and we're not allowed to use solid foundation walls. So we're looking at open foundations, columns, and piles, and ASCE 24 then requires you to use that elevation guidance to the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member, and that's shown in the diagram to the right, as you can see that kind of cross-hatched piece of lumber that would be coming out towards you if you're looking at this, and that's that bottom of that lowest horizontal structural member. So foundation design in A zones, it's going to be required to resist flotation, collapse, and permanent lateral movement under these design loads, under these flood loads. It's the moving water, the still water, the buoyancy or the uplift on that, and then you have to have adequate connections between the foundation and the superstructure is just the main portion of the house. And then you need to either meet the building code or ASCE 24, whichever is more restrictive. And we've got some guidance on slab on grade, piers, piles, columns, posts, open foundations, as well as crawl spaces. And the big difference you're going to see with crawl spaces is that they're required to have flood openings. So we want to equalize the water on each side of those foundation walls using flood openings. If we look in V zones and coastal A zones, again, these are open foundations, and we want to make sure to minimize the flood forces acting on the foundation. We want to be free of obstruction, so we don't want anything such as foundation walls to be in the way, and we want to let that water flow in and out pretty easily. So this is piles, piers, posts, and we've got a description of what sections of ASCE 24 would apply in these areas. So foundations in V zones, we need to verify when we're doing design in these areas that the existing foundation elements will be able to resist the loads, apply those loads to existing and new portions of the foundation. So if you're elevating a house and you may be using a portion of the existing footings or some section like that, you need to check those loads on there too. Now, how ASCE 24 may need to be deemed to comply is you may not be able to do all the checks on that existing footing section that you would with was something that an engineer had designed from scratch and was constructed from scratch. So that's where you may be deemed to comply. And then ASCE 24 provisions don't apply when you're talking about elevating a house to the superstructure. That's another section that if you were building a brand new house, there would be sections that would more apply to the superstructure of the house. And ASCE 7 would apply to the superstructure of the house, but mainly we're concerned with the engineer saying that the foundation elements meet ASCE 24 when we're talking about retrofit structures. So enclosures, these are the walls around the bottom of the building. In an A zone, they can, and V zone, they can only be used for parking, access, and storage. Having those walls will affect your premiums, and then there are requirements in those flood openings about the number, the size, location, and then if you do have breakaway walls, which you can have in coastal areas, that somebody puts some wall around the building, that those walls are supposed to have flood openings regardless. If we're talking about V zones and coastal A zones, again, the same uses apply. Anytime you have any sort of wall around that are breakaway walls, unless it's if they're actual walls, then those are going to have insurance implications for the building. There are requirements that if you've got lattice and screening that meet some certain requirements, that will be considered free of obstruction, and that's not going to be an insurance, additional insurance premium for you. Breakaway walls must fail under a base flood or lesser condition. And the big thing with adopting ASCE 24 is that in coastal A zones, you need to have flood openings. That's a requirement that's in ASCE 24. It also applies to V zones in ASCE 24 where there's a requirement for flood openings now. So if you use ASCE 24 and you've got a building in a V zone with breakaway walls, it's required to have flood openings. Here's some examples of compliant foundations. You'll see on the left there's a house that's got some lattice work on the front porch, and then you'll see that circle that's a flood opening around that crawl space wall. And then if we look in V zones, this is a post-disaster photo of a breakaway wall that actually performed as we would expect. There's some technical bulletins. This is some good additional information. Technical Bulletin 1 on the left is for openings in foundation walls. The middle one, Technical Bulletin 5, is on these free of obstruction requirements for buildings in V zones that I talked about. And then Technical Bulletin 9 is on breakaway wall requirements. Building materials in A zones, and these are going to basically apply in V zones, but it needs to be constructed with flood damage resistant materials. FEMA has a Technical Bulletin 2 that outlines a lot of what these types of materials are and what is that material. It must resist damage, corrosion, deterioration, decay, and that's for 72 hours with minimal damage, and it's basically defined as cosmetic only damage. There are some specific requirements in ASCE 24 that are more restrictive than Technical Bulletin 2, so you do want to look at that. And then the key difference, if you're looking at A zones, V zones, or coastal A zones, is just the minimum elevation that you're required to go up to. So basically, how high do you need to be taking those flood-resistant design, flood-resistant materials? Utilities, they must either be elevated or if you can't elevate some of these utilities, there's a requirement that basically they're allowed below that base flood elevation if they're designed and constructed and installed to prevent floodwaters, including any backflow, from entering and accumulating within the components. So there's some specific requirements on those if you can't elevate those. But these utilities are MEP systems, elevators, lifts, as we talked about earlier, and then ASCE 24 does give you some minimum elevation requirements for each of these areas. If you're talking about V zones and coastal A zones, there's additional requirements about those wave loads, erosion, and scour that these utilities need to be designed to resist. So in A zones, it's BFE plus 2. In V zones, it's again BFE plus 2, but remember we have this higher elevation in this lowest floor, lowest horizontal structural member component that happens in V zones. So if we're looking at elevation, this is actually lifting up or jacking up a house, raising it in the A zone. This is just building that new foundation wall around it, and you're allowed to use solid foundation walls provided you're incorporating these flood openings. If you're looking at a V zone or this coastal A zone, then you're going to need to go to an open foundation. If you look at the before picture on the right, that's the house walls go all the way down to the just above the ground, and then you'll see in this picture on the right that that's an elevated house on an open foundation where they've had to use columns in this instance. So applying it to elevation projects, so there's foundation types that are allowable, and that'll be dictated by the flood zone. So we showed those earlier. It needs to be able to resist this flotation collapse and lateral movement. If you're using any of these existing foundations, you're going to have to verify that those components could comply as much as possible with ASCE 24. You need to have these flood openings that we discussed, and all these materials below there need to meet Technical Bulletin 2, and as well as these utilities be either elevated or protected, as we discussed. If we're talking about mitigation reconstruction, this is where you have a building that you're going to just take down the entire building and build a new structure. If you're using ASCE 24, the entire building needs to comply with ASCE 24. And there's references within ASCE 24 that say that you're going to comply with ASCE 7. So if that's going to be your requirement, then the entire building must be treated as a brand new structure, and you're going to have to meet ASCE 24 and ASCE 7 by reference for that new building in its entirety. So if you're going to say that you're going to meet ASCE 24 as part of your CDBG mitigation grant, then you need to understand that that's what that requirement is going to be. So if we're talking about non-residential, this applies to commercial buildings, government buildings, critical actions that we discussed before, and non-residential portions of mixed-use buildings. Now, the retrofit elevation and reconstruction, those would basically be similar to what we talked about for the residential, but this is the addition in this of allowing dry floodproofing. So what dry floodproofing is, I'll discuss this in a minute, but basically this is where you're going to waterproof the wall system in order to prevent water from getting in, and then anywhere you've got openings, those could be doorways, those could be things like windows, you're going to put a flood shield in front of that to protect the water from getting to that. So that's going to be the additional topic that we're going to cover in these next few slides. The minimum elevation requirements are based on ASCE 24 design class. And again, you need to make sure that if you're trying to use this as part of it and you're not familiar with it, that you actually have discussed this with the designer and that you've got some additional time set aside for those special inspections. So how does it apply to critical actions? So the critical actions requirement is that you'll either meet that BFE plus 3 feet or the 500 year, whichever is higher. One of the other things to consider is if the 500 year is unavailable and the critical action is within the special flood hazard area, then the structure must be elevated or flood-proof to at least the BFE plus 3. So what are these critical actions? Examples of it would be hospitals, nursing homes, police stations, fire stations, or principal utility lines. So that could be more inclusive, for instance, if you're going to consider your water treatment or wastewater treatment utility lines as principal utility lines, and that may be more restrictive than ASCE 24 in this instance. So a mixed-use building, this is basically might be, say, an apartment building where you've got apartments on the upper floors and commercial on the lower floor, or maybe you've got some other non-residential governmental use on that lower floor. So this would get broken up into the non-residential portions of the mixed-use building and the residential. And to simplify this long bullet, basically, for those non-residential portions of the building, you're required to either elevate those or dry flood-proof those to that base flood elevation plus 2 feet. For the residential sections and all of the associated components that would be used by those residential sections, then that needs to be just elevated to that base flood elevation plus 2 feet. So this gets a little bit more tricky when you're talking about these buildings, because you may have utilities, for instance, that are used by both the residential sections and the non-residential sections, and in that instance you would need to comply with the residential section, because that's going to fall into that category. And mainly where this breakup of residential versus non-residential happens is with respect to the National Flood Insurance Program. Those requirements specifically address residential versus non-residential. So that's part of where these requirements are coming from, is compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program. So dry flood proofing, as I said, this is using a waterproofing measure to protect the building. It is not allowable in these V zones or these high flood risk areas, coastal high flood areas, and the coastal A zones. So it's not allowed in those areas. So this is just allowed in A zones if you're going to use dry flood proofing. So the requirement is, again, base flood elevation plus 2 feet, or the local requirement. There may be a local requirement that's more restrictive, whichever is higher. Again, there's a kind of a 3-part requirement if you're getting to these Class 4 buildings, the BFE plus 3 feet, the 500-year, or the DFE when you're talking about these critical actions. So applying it to dry flood proofing, you need to meet the elevation requirements and the flood zone restrictions. There's also a flood velocity restriction of if the water is moving more than 5 feet per second, you can't do dry flood proofing. So there's material aspects of ASCE 24. There's a requirement for substantially impermeable without the assistance of sump pumps, and that's substantially impermeable means that you would accumulate no more than 4 inches of water within that dry flood-proofed area over 24 hours. Sump pumps are required as a means to remove the accumulated water, so think about that 4 inches of water. How are you going to get that out? There's egress requirements, so getting people out. And then there's flood warning times of 12 hours that there's restrictions about. Also, looking at your covers and shields and making sure those meet the load requirements, and that if those covers and shields are used, that you've got a flood emergency plan as in terms of, think about an operations and maintenance plan in terms of, and then when are you going to implement these measures, and all of that needs to be provided to the authority having jurisdiction per ASCE 24. So looking at these requirements, again, dry flood proofing is primarily intended for non-residential buildings. This could include utility systems. The other place that we see people sometimes looking at it is with historic residential buildings that are currently used in a non-residential capacity. So think about an old house that may have been turned into a law office or some other type of business that might use these buildings, or a governmental office, and those may also look at dry flood proofing. So we're not looking at the occupancy of the building when it was originally constructed, but the current occupancy of the building. And there are limited instances where you can do dry flood proofing in residential buildings, but we're not going to cover that in this, primarily because ASCE 24 was designed for substantial improvement and substantial damage, and it also eliminates a lot of the requirements when you start looking at historically designated buildings. If you opt to dry flood proof, there's a flood proofing certificate. It's required by the National Flood Insurance Program for flood insurance purposes, but also you're required to submit some documentation of flood proofing to the authority having jurisdiction. You'll need to check with the authority having jurisdiction about what flood proofing verification they're currently using. That's actually the types of documentation are outlined in 44 CFR 60.3. in terms of what all is required. But this new form that we have right now is an as-built certificate. That means it was designed and constructed to be meet ASCE 24. So here's another time when ASCE 24 is required if you're going to use this floodproofing certificate. It talks about what it's intended for, which is basically non-residential structures, and then also looking at mixed-use areas where there's non-residential use. It's important that building owners kind of understand what's involved in it as well as the people signing it. And again, it requires compliance with ASCE 24 when you sign that. And that needs to be signed by a registered design professional in the state where that floodproofing is done. So looking at historic structure, these are a few different examples of buildings in Belhaven, North Carolina. These are the buildings that I originally looked at in '99, and they were elevated under a FEMA grant. But you can just see that these older houses were elevated in just the different ways that they were elevated and maintain their historic appearance. So what makes a building historic? There's some general guidelines. We're not going to get too specific into this, but there's some guidelines about the National Historic Register, state inventories. There's some National Register criteria for evaluation that you may need to look at. Some significance in American history, architecture, archaeology. And then there's also some instances where it needs to maintain the integrity of the location. So this may be not only that building, but the area around it that you're having to look at. And we have a web link for that. So historic structure considerations. HUD encourages the retention of historic integrity. You're just going to have to look at weighing this sort of protection of the building versus maintaining historic integrity, and that's often done not only at the local level but at the state level and federal level outside of this process that we're talking about today. But there's a determination that needs to be made, and if that historic integrity can't be maintained, then you may need to work with the grant administrator to understand how restrictions apply. And if you're planning on using as part of your grant program ASCE 24, then you'll have to figure out how that's going to apply in those instances. So you'll need to consider these when evaluating those effects: the height, scale, proportions of the building, the architectural character, the footprint, orientation, location, landscape features, the archaeology, site evaluation, and then how it may impact adjoining structures or historic districts. So those are all factors that you're going to need to look at when you're talking about historic buildings. So to just kind of wrap all this up, so we've talked a lot about what ASCE 24 is, what the requirements are, and that sort of thing. But again, it is a recommendation with respect to these CDBG mitigation grants. It's a tool for you to use, and you should really evaluate the benefits of using ASCE 24. It can be used to reduce building and the contents damage during a flood event. It's an increased factor of safety. Now, when you're applying these minimum elevation requirements of the HUD, you're going to get an additional foot above what those minimum requirements are, but also looking at all of the other requirements, materials, and that sort of thing that go into ASCE 24 and how it is a holistic approach to protecting the building during flood. So all of that amounts to a total factor of safety, and that's one of the reasons why you want to look at doing it. If you're looking at homeowners or even business owners, reduce time out of the house or the building after a flood event, even if the owners have and maintain flood insurance. Flood insurance doesn't cover displacement. There's other programs associated with that, but a lot of this displacement and business loss is not covered in a regular flood insurance policy, only the building and the contents. And so there's some additional benefits with that you've got to kind of think about. And then it has an ability, because you're going up above that base flood elevation, to provide you with lower flood insurance premiums. So that's another additional factor. And then communities who adopt and enforce ASCE 24 may be eligible for community rating system credits. So if you're enforcing this community and you're part of this community rating system, your policyholders throughout your community may be eligible for an increased break in their flood insurance rates. So getting access to ASCE 24, we've got a web address here, and then you can also purchase it through the American Society of Civil Engineers. I don't have a current price on it. I apologize, but it is available for sale there. Let's see if I can click. Okay, FEMA resources. Several years ago, there's a specific slide on this, but there was a guidance document about using this with hazard mitigation assistance, flood retrofitting projects, and reconstruction projects. I'd encourage you guys to download a copy of that and look at that, but there's also highlights of ASCE 24, the 2414 version, the 2014 version of ASCE 24. That document is already in your handouts, but there's also a 2005 edition. And that's covered. FEMA 259 is retrofitting residential structures. So this is how the elevation process works and some other mitigation options. FEMA 348 is looking at your mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems, those building systems and how to protect those. FEMA 55, if you're in a coastal area, this is the Coastal Construction Manual. And it would be helpful for you to use this not only for residential but non-residential buildings in coastal areas, just to kind of understand how flood loads work. And then FEMA 936 is the floodproofing of non-residential buildings. So this is the how-to guide on dry floodproofing. We also discussed the NFIP technical bulletins, and all of these have links to them. If you go to the FEMA Building Sciences publication page, there's a link to right there. We would also encourage you to think about getting a copy of the Codemaster. This is a 12-step procedure on determining loads for design with the code, with respect to the codes and meeting the flood provisions within the code. It's based on the IBC, the IRC, ASCE 7, and ASCE 24. It includes illustrations, a step-by-step example, and it was done through the International Code Council with FEMA support, and then I've provided a link for you to the ICC website. This guidance for using ASCE 24 for hazard mitigation projects, I'd encourage you to download and look at this. It's not the actual ASCE 24 standard, but it gives you some overviews, and it talks about how to use it with a grant. There's some helpful checklists and guidelines and how to look at it with respect to benefit cost analysis if you need to still do that and that sort of thing too. So, and that's just really helpful also when you look at these retrofit projects where you're having to deem to comply, where you may be keeping portions of the existing foundation or something like that, and you're going to have to figure out how to apply ASCE 24. Remember that CDBG mitigation requirements are more restrictive with respect to the elevation, but there's also some other good guidance that's within this. So I'm going to turn back over to Roosevelt and let him wrap this up.
Okay, thank you so much, Adam. Certainly want to acknowledge the great presentation that you did here to help give us some background information on the use of ASCE 24. Certainly covered a lot of ground, and wanted to just remind the grantees here that this is certainly a standard that can be used if you opt to do it. And a couple of things I want to point out before I get into the exact slides here. So Adam pointed out some different foundation types and height requirements connected to where the structure is located in a special flood hazard area. He certainly spoke to the standard here and certainly looking at how it may be triggered if you have a substantial damage or substantial improvement. Adam certainly talked about some of the requirements for critical actions and certainly connected to the energy lifeline if you have a principal utility line that you're looking to address. And certainly that's important for critical services both before, during, and after a disaster. I've mentioned this in previous webinars, and I think it's very relevant for today. We've talked about in previous webinars the value of mitigation and leveraging your federal funds, and so the publications that have come out in 2017 and 2018 have pointed to the value of mitigation So for every dollar spent in terms of federal funding, particularly when you look at disaster-resistant building codes, it could yield up to $11 in benefits. So certainly looking at disaster-resistant building codes and standards such as ASCE CE 24 can be an important pillar or aspect of how our grantees can promote their long-term resilience strategy. To that end, I want to go back to some of the information that Clay spoke of in his CDBG-MIT portion of the webinar. He talked about the importance of those 4 MIT goals, looking at how the grantees can certainly look at their current and future risk. And he also spoke about the importance of leveraging those federal funding streams. So with that, let me quickly walk through the HUD goals here in terms of utilizing or leveraging that value of ASCE 24 and meeting CDBG-MIT goals. So for goal number 1, looking at supported data-informed investments and focusing on rep loss, property, and protecting critical infrastructure. Clearly, through the information that Adam presented today, we see how ASCE 24 provides a consensus standard for flood construction, definitely for new construction, repair of substantial damage and substantial improvements. For HUD goal number 2 that Clay spoke of, he mentioned the building capacity to comprehensively analyze disaster risks and then updating your hazard mitigation plan. And you can see the circles there on your right are some examples of ways that we can do that or that you can do that as a grantee. But I would certainly like to point out the value of the mitigation plan in developing your mitigation strategies. That hazard identification and risk assessment component can be leveraged by the CDBG-MIT grantees in their action plan and certainly in building their mitigation needs assessment. For HUD goal number 3, that looks at supporting the policies that reflect local and regional priorities, driving down disaster costs, protecting critical lifelines, and certainly having a long-term community risk reduction effort. To that end, use of CE24, again, I think Adam spoke to this at a high level, can help reduce future disaster costs, reduce building occupant displacement, and definitely protecting community lifelines. And he mentioned the primary utility lines as an example. Last, we have HUD goal number 4, which is maximizing the impact of leveraging your public and private partnerships and then coordinating with other federal dollars. Certainly, Clay spoke to that in the beginning. I reemphasize that. And then certainly the information that we have from Adam takes a look at leveraging ASCE 24 as a standard of practice and providing partners confidence in the long-term resiliency of their investment. So here's pretty much a very, very high-level quick summary of the great information that Adam presented, and we thank both you and Clay for the information that you presented today. With that, I just want to quickly walk you through some CDBG-MIT resources, particularly if you take a look at the link here for the CDBG mitigation notice that was published last August, and it has a lot of the requirements and information that certainly Adam and definitely Clay spoke to in their respective presentations. I would encourage you to take a look at that for more background. Also, starting last fall, we had the CDBG-MIT 2019 webinar series, and all of those have been recorded, and the transcripts were provided, and then also the slides. And again, as you're building out your action plans for CDBG-MIT, this may be relevant and important for you to help design your particular program. Here's an email address, again, for the policy unit within DRSI. If you have questions either that are not answered today or you just have future questions related to mitigation or potentially ASCE 24, I would encourage you to please take a look at emailing DRSI, that's DRSI Policy Unit at HUD.gov. And then if you, again, want to email FEMA directly, and they're building science subject matter experts. Please email FEMA-building science help@fema.dhs.gov. That's FEMA-building science help@fema.dhs.gov. So with that, I think that's the last slide. So why don't we go ahead and transfer that over to Clay to quickly ask a couple of questions to Adam. Thank you.
Thanks, Roosevelt. Appreciate it. All right, I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar. We have some questions in the questions and answer section, and both John and Adam have actually already started to go through and answer some of them. So if you want to take a look at some of the questions that have been asked and already answered, you can see them in the Q&A box on the lower right section of the presentation screen. I want to answer one that hasn't been answered yet, that's CDBG-MIT specific. Kurt asks, can CDBG-MIT grants funds be used to cover cost of elevation cert costs for lower income property owners to help determine mitigation options? And I don't want to say specifically yes to that. I'd want to think about that a little bit more. But yes, generally, the goal of in the Federal Register notice is to make sure that we are encouraging other potential flood elevation standards above the base requirement that we have in the notice if a grantee opts to incorporate them or adopt them. And so what that means is that these costs associated with using the standard are eligible for use as a grantee. So it's an eligible use of funds to explore the ASCE 24 standard. How those costs get determined to be eligible on a case-by-case basis, you can reach out to us at DRSI Policy Unit at HUD.gov. And I think that answers that one. So a couple other I just want to highlight. Looks like most of them got answered. Okay, here's one. Adam, are you familiar with 406 MIT funding? Brian asked, can you quickly explain the difference between 406 MIT and HUD CDBG funding?
Let's see, the 406 is the public assistance funding source from FEMA. And so basically it's where the money is coming from, whether it's HUD dollars or public assistance dollars. So yeah, I don't know what more to say about that, okay. But it's the funding source.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I can jump in and just mention to Brian, so we're encouraging these HUD CDBG MIT dollars to be part of a long-term vision and even part of other projects. What that does mean, though, is that the part that's going to be you're using your CDBG MIT funding for will have to follow the rules and regulations for HUD's CDBG MIT program. And so we have certain other federal requirements in our funding sources that you may want to consider, and our actual rules and regulations for spending the money. And you can reach out to us at the email provided or to your grant manager who's working with you. Okay, we also have another one, Adam. Given that a property, this is Edwin, given that a property in an SFHA is federally funded, are there instances where the acknowledgement of conditions for mitigation of property form is not required?
That I do not know. I'm going to say we're going to have to get back with them on that one.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, I'll have Edwin, if you can email that to us, we'll work on getting a reply to you. And I think that is most of the questions. I just want to highlight some that were already answered in the Q&A box in case people haven't navigated to it. Question was from Heather was, how are mixed-use buildings treated, such as multifamily and daycare? And we had a couple slides on that, and they're addressed in the flood design class tables in ASCE 24.
Yeah, and with respect to sort of mixed-use buildings, hopefully soon we will have and you guys can check, we're literally talking hopefully weeks, that there should be new guidance issued from FEMA floodplain management. There's a new publication that's going through external affairs review now that will cover specifically mixed-use buildings. So it will cover flood mitigation measures for mixed-use buildings and get into really some of the details about how to break out the residential and non-residential portions of the building and how each of those can be treated, and then several instances of sort of how do you make sure you're compliant when you start dealing with these mixed-use buildings and sort of these areas where you've got residential and non-residential areas. So it should add a lot of clarity, and like I said, we're expecting that in the next few weeks. So if you give me a minute, I'll get you a number on what that FEMA publication number is.
That's great. And one other one that I wanted to highlight, and maybe Adam, you could reiterate the answer on this one as well, is does FEMA require compliance to ASCE 24 for PA funding?
Let's see.
The response says ASCE 24 is incorporated by reference in the IBC, IRC, and PA minimum standards policy guides.
Yeah. I mean, if you're talking about since those PA funds would pretty much go to non-residential buildings that would be covered in the IBC, it's going to be covered at minimum by reference to the codes. The fact that there's a code requirement with public assistance.
Okay, great.
That's a long way of saying yes.
Yeah. Alita asks, if flood insurance is not available, how can we mitigate an existing building? And yeah.
So I guess we're talking about a building that's in a community that is not a member of the National Flood Insurance Program. I would assume that that's the situation that we're talking about. I think if we can get an email address on that, I think we should probably send that person to the FEMA flood insurance helpline and get them to answer formally that question, because we're building science, and I don't want to step on any toes with that requirement. So I think that's probably the best way to answer that. The multifamily publication, like I said, I would check back in the next few weeks, but that's FEMA P-2037. Again, that's FEMA P-2037, and it's called Flood Mitigation Measures for Multifamily Buildings.
Okay, great. Thank you. And one last question before we wrap up here. An observation was made, major requirement of PA mitigation, aka 406 mitigation, is being cost effective. They noticed that if compliance with codes and standards does not have to be shown as cost effective, it is inherent in the fact that it achieved a status of codes and standards. So they're asking, is that a correct observation that they made? Here I see that if compliance with codes and standards does not have to be shown as cost effective, it is inherent in the fact that it is achieved as a status of codes and standards.
I'm going to take a screenshot of that also and get somebody that is a public assistance guru to answer that one.
Okay, great. All right, it's now 3:27. If anyone who's attending the meeting has any other questions, feel free to email us, drsipolicyunit@hud.gov. We covered a lot of ground in this ASCE 24 building standard, which goes above and beyond our minimum requirements for CDBG-MIT programs. So for grantees that are looking to have a way to spend money to develop a higher standard, this is one that you can opt in for. I want to thank Adam Reeder for presenting for us, and for John for answering a lot of the questions in the Q&A box here. And I also want to mention that if you enjoyed this webinar, this is part of a series, as we mentioned earlier, and you can register at HUD Exchange, our website, for our mailing list for upcoming webinars, and you can register for individual webinars on the website itself. And with that, I'll want to end today's webinar, and thank you, all the grantees, for joining us at this presentation.